In the heart of San Francisco, where the hilly streets meet the foggy bay, lived a man whose name was synonymous with success. James Warren Hampton, a 48-year-old technology magnate, had everything one could dream of: a fortune in the hundreds of millions of dollars, the power to change the course of the industry, and a reputation as a visionary in the world of innovation. Born into a middle-class family in Oakland, California, James showed an aptitude for math and programming from an early age. His father, a school teacher, and mother, an accountant, always encouraged his hobbies, even when they didn't fully understand his passion for computers. At the age of 12, James created his first video game, and by the time he was 16, he had already sold his first application to a major technology company. After graduating from Stanford University with honors in the year 2001, James did not seek employment with large corporations like many of his fellow students. Instead, he rented a small office in Palo Alto and founded his first startup. The company, which specialized in developing machine learning algorithms, quickly attracted the attention of venture capitalists. 3 years later, James sold it for $80 million, which was the beginning of his ascent into the ranks of the technological elite. The next decade was filled with ups and downs. James founded 5 more companies, 3 of which became incredibly successful and 2 of which failed. But he saw even the failures as valuable lessons, often saying, "Failure is just another step toward success." His latest project, a platform for personalized online education, was valued at $2 billion just 5 years after launch. Now, in his 2023 year, James lived in a luxurious mansion in Pacific Heights, one of San Francisco's most prestigious neighborhoods. The house, built in the early 20th century and fully restored, combined classic architecture with ultra-modern technology. From the panoramic windows offered a breathtaking view of the bay and the Golden Gate Bridge. Despite his huge fortune, James tried to lead a relatively modest lifestyle. He preferred simple jeans and t-shirts to expensive suits, and his only real passion, apart from technology, was vintage cars. In the garage of his mansion stood an impressive collection, including a '65 Ford Mustang and a 246 Ferrari Dino. James had been married to Elizabeth Hampton, née Clark, for 7 years. They met at a fundraiser at the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, where Elizabeth worked as a curator. Her beauty immediately caught James's eye, but it was her sharp mind and passion for art that won his heart. A year later, they were married in a small ceremony on the beach in Carmel. Elizabeth, now 32 years old, was a former model who had left the runway for a career in the art world. Her knowledge and connections had helped James amass an impressive collection of modern art that now adorned the walls of their mansion. Together, they were one of the most prominent couples in San Francisco high society, regularly appearing in the society pages and charity events. James's brother, Michael Hampton, was 9 years younger and worked as a successful lawyer in one of the leading law firms in the city. The brothers were always close despite the age difference. Michael often acted as James's trusted advisor, helping him with the legal aspects of his business. He was a regular at the Hamptons' home, often dropping by for family dinners and weekend barbecues. James's life seemed perfect from the outside. He had a beautiful wife, a successful brother, a thriving business, and the respect of his colleagues. However, behind the facade of success was a man who never felt truly fulfilled. James was always striving for more, whether in business or in his personal life. This trait made him a successful entrepreneur, but it also created tension in his relationships. Recently, James began to notice a change in Elizabeth's behavior. She became more thoughtful, checking her phone frequently and sometimes canceling their plans together. At first, he wrote it off to the stress of her work at the museum, but gradually doubts crept into his soul. Could she be unhappy in their marriage? Or worse, is there someone else? These thoughts haunted James as he sat in his home office, looking out at the lights of the city at night. He thought back to how he'd met Elizabeth, their first date at a small Italian restaurant in North Beach, the romantic marriage proposal. Was all of that now in jeopardy? James had never been a man to sit back when faced with a problem. Whether it was a business crisis or a personal dilemma, he always preferred to act. And now, feeling that his perfect life might be crumbling, he decided he had to find out the truth, no matter how bitter it might be. Taking out his smartphone, James opened his contacts and found a number he hoped never to use. It was the number for Eagle Eye, a private detective agency that had once been recommended to him by a colleague for vetting potential business partners. James never thought he would have to use their services for personal use, but now he felt he had no choice. James's finger hovered over the call button. Part of him was screaming that this was wrong, that he should trust his wife. But the other part, the part that had made him a successful businessman, insisted that he needed to know the truth in order to make an informed decision. After all, wasn't that how he had always approached problems in his business? Wednesday, March 22, 2023, began as usual for James Warren Hampton. He woke up at 5:30 in the morning, drank his morning smoothie of spinach and goji berries, spent half an hour at the home gym, and by 7 o'clock was ready to start his workday. Elizabeth, his wife, was still asleep, which wasn't quite usual. They usually had breakfast together before going their separate ways. James went down to his home office located in the east wing of their mansion. The panoramic windows overlooked San Francisco Bay, which was now shrouded in morning fog. He turned on his computer and plunged into his work, reviewing the reports and emails that had accumulated overnight. Around 9 o'clock, James heard Elizabeth's footsteps on the stairs. He left the office expecting to see her in the living room, but instead he heard the front door slam. Looking out the window, he saw Elizabeth get into her silver Mercedes and quickly drive out of the yard. It was strange. Usually Elizabeth never left without saying goodbye. James pulled out his phone and texted her, "Good morning, darling. Where are you off to so early?" The reply didn't come until an hour later. "Sorry, honey. Urgent meeting at the museum. I'll tell you tonight." James frowned. Something about that answer didn't seem right. In 7 years of marriage, he had gotten used to Elizabeth always sharing her plans with him. This sudden secrecy was unlike her. All day, James couldn't concentrate on his work. His thoughts kept returning to his wife's strange behavior. He tried to remember if there had been any other unusual moments lately, and the more he thought, the more little things popped into his mind. 3 weeks ago, Elizabeth had canceled their traditional Friday night dinner at the Golden Olive, citing a headache. James hadn't given it much thought at the time. Everyone had bad days. But now he remembered that in the evening of the same day, he had heard her having a long conversation with someone on the phone in the garden, laughing and speaking in a low voice. Then there was the incident at the charity event last Saturday. James noticed Elizabeth checking her phone several times, clearly expecting some kind of message. When he asked if everything was okay, she smiled a little strained and said she was waiting for important news about the upcoming exhibition. And of course, there were the constant visits from his brother Michael. James used to be glad that Michael and Elizabeth were getting along so well. But now, he began to remember moments when he caught them having quiet conversations that would abruptly break off as soon as he entered the room. By late afternoon, James's paranoia had peaked. He tried to calm himself down by saying that it could all have innocent explanations. Maybe Elizabeth was really working on some important project at the museum. Maybe Michael was helping her with legal matters. But another part of his brain, the part that was always looking for patterns and anomalies in the data, couldn't ignore all these oddities. That part whispered that perhaps something more serious was going on. What if Elizabeth was unhappy in their marriage? What if she had found someone else? The thought that Elizabeth might have cheated on him was almost unbearable. James had always prided himself on building the perfect life, a successful business, a beautiful home, a loving wife. The thought that it all might have been an illusion made him feel disoriented and vulnerable. At 7 o'clock that evening, Elizabeth finally arrived home. She walked into the living room where James sat with a glass of whiskey, pretending to read a book. "Hello, darling," she said, leaning over to kiss his cheek. "I'm sorry about this morning. We had some unforeseen problems with an upcoming exhibition." James looked at her carefully. Elizabeth looked a little tired, but otherwise as usual. Her long brown hair was gathered into an elegant bun, and she was wearing the same dress she had left in this morning. "It's all right," he replied, trying to keep his voice sounding casual. "I hope you were able to work out the problems." Elizabeth nodded, but James thought something akin to guilt flashed in her eyes. "Yes, more or less. Look, I'm really tired. Do you mind if we just order something for dinner?" "Of course not," James said. "I'll order your favorite pizza from Tony's." Elizabeth smiled and went upstairs, saying she wanted to take a shower. James stared after her, feeling suspicion gnawing at him from the inside out. The evening passed in a strange atmosphere. They ate pizza while sitting in front of the TV discussing some reality show, but James could feel the tension in the air. Elizabeth seemed distracted, checking her phone frequently. When James asked if she was expecting an important call, she quickly shook her head and put the phone screen down. Around 10 o'clock, Elizabeth said that she was very tired and wanted to go to bed early. James nodded, saying that he would work some more. As soon as she left, he quietly made his way to his office and closed the door. Sitting at his desk, James felt his mind torn between rational thought and emotion. Part of him wanted to just talk to Elizabeth, to ask her directly what was going on. But the other part was afraid to hear the answer. What if his worst fears were confirmed? In the end, James's entrepreneurial instincts took over. He had always believed in the importance of information. In business, he never made major decisions without having all the facts. Why should his personal life be an exception? James opened his desk drawer and pulled out a business card from the Eagle Eye Detective Agency. He held it in his hands for several minutes, weighing the pros and cons. Finally, he took a deep breath and dialed the number on the card. "Eagle Eye Detective Agency. How may I help you?" A female voice answered after the third beep. James hesitated for a second, but then said firmly, "Hello, my name is James Hampton. I need your help with an investigation of a personal nature." "Of course, Mr. Hampton," the voice replied professionally. "Could you please elaborate a little more on the situation?" James took a deep breath and began to recount his suspicions. With each word, he felt something inside him change. He knew that after this call, his life would never be the same again. By the time he ended the call and hung up, it was well past midnight. James looked at the picture on his desk, him and Elizabeth on the beach on their wedding day, both glowing with happiness. He ran his finger along the glass, feeling a lump come up to his throat. "I'm sorry, my love," he whispered to the pictures, "but I must know the truth." On May 7th, 2023, at precisely 7 o'clock in the morning, Detective Sarah Johnson parked her unremarkable gray Ford Fusion on a quiet street in the Pacific Heights neighborhood. She'd chosen a spot with a good view of the elegant Hampton family mansion, but far enough away so as not to attract attention. Sarah took a sip of strong black coffee from a thermal mug and prepared herself for a long day of observation. In her 12 years as a private investigator, Sarah had seen many difficult cases, but this one seemed particularly delicate. James Hampton, one of Silicon Valley's most powerful technology moguls, suspected his wife and his own brother of having a secret affair. The situation was so delicate that the owner of the Eagle Eye Agency had personally assigned the case to Sarah, his top investigator. Sarah pulled a file folder on the Hampton family out of her bag and ran her eyes over the basic facts one more time. James Warren Hampton, 48 years old, founder and CEO of Neurotech Innovations. Wealth estimated at several $100 million. Married to Elizabeth Hampton, née Clark, 32 years old, former model, now a curator at the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art. The marriage has lasted 7 years. No children. Michael Hampton, 39, James's younger brother, a successful attorney at the law firm of Goldman and Associates. At exactly 8:30, the front door of the Hamptons' mansion opened, and Sarah saw Elizabeth Hampton, dressed in an elegant blue dress and high-heeled shoes, walk down the steps to a waiting silver Mercedes. Sarah took a few pictures with her long lens camera, noting to herself that Mrs. Hampton looked a little pale and tired. As soon as the Mercedes pulled away, Sarah started her Ford and began the pursuit, keeping a safe distance. They drove through the city, and eventually Elizabeth parked near the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art. Sarah parked a block away from the museum and pulled out her binoculars. For the next few hours, nothing out of the ordinary happened. Elizabeth seemed to be completely immersed in her work, meeting with co-workers and discussing some paperwork. Sarah made several calls to her informants, trying to find out about the museum's current projects and possible causes of stress for its staff. Around noon, Elizabeth left the museum and headed to a small cafe nearby. Sarah, quickly changing into more casual clothes and wearing a wig, followed her and took a table in the corner of the cafe from where she could discreetly observe the subject. Mrs. Hampton ordered a salad and mineral water but seemed more interested in her phone than her food. She checked the screen frequently and typed messages rapidly. Sarah made a mental note to check Elizabeth's phone records if it became necessary. Suddenly Elizabeth's face brightened and she waved to someone at the entrance. Sarah tensed, expecting to see Michael Hampton, James's brother. Instead, however, an elegant woman in her 50s approached the table. Sarah took a few discreet photos with the hidden camera in her glasses and turned on a directional microphone disguised as an ordinary pen. "Elizabeth, dear, how are you feeling?" the woman asked with obvious concern in her voice. "Better, Dr. Reynolds, thank you," Elizabeth replied. "The nausea has abated a bit, but I still feel weak." Sarah frowned. "Doctor, nausea?" That was unexpected. There was no information in the file about Elizabeth's health problems. The detective began making notes in her notebook, trying not to miss any details of the conversation. The conversation went on for about an hour, and although Sarah couldn't hear all the details because of the background noise in the cafe, it was clear that they were talking about a medical condition of some sort. Elizabeth seemed concerned, and Dr. Reynolds seemed sympathetic and supportive. They discussed some tests, possible treatment options, and the need to keep things private. When the meeting was over, Elizabeth returned to the museum, and Sarah quickly left the cafe and returned to her car. She pulled out her cell phone and dialed James Hampton's number. "Mr. Hampton, this is Sarah Johnson. I have some information you should know. Your wife met with the doctor this afternoon. It seems she has some health issues that you may not be aware of." A long pause hung on the other end of the line. When James finally spoke, his voice sounded strained. "Thank you, Miss Johnson. Please continue your surveillance. I want to know everything." The rest of the day passed without incident. Elizabeth worked late and didn't get home until around 8 in the evening. Sarah took a few more pictures, noting that Mrs. Hampton looked exhausted. The next morning, Sarah returned to her observation post at 7 in the morning. She spent the night researching Dr. Reynolds' background and trying to find any clues about Elizabeth's medical condition. It turned out that Dr. Reynolds was a renowned oncologist, which only added to Sarah's anxiety. Around 10 in the morning, she noticed a black BMW pull up to the house. Michael Hampton, James's brother, stepped out of it. Sarah tensed, preparing for a possible break in the case. She set up a directional microphone at the front door and began recording. Liz, how are you? Michael's voice sounded concerned. Not so good, Mike. These new medications. They're wearing me out, Elizabeth replied tiredly. I brought the papers you asked for. Let's look them over together. Sarah heard the door close and the sound of voices became muffled. She quickly wrote down the time of Michael's arrival and began to think through possible scenarios. Michael spent about 2 hours in the house. When he finally came out, Elizabeth walked him to his car. They hugged, and Sarah noticed that Elizabeth seemed to be crying. Michael gently stroked her back before getting into the car and driving away. Sarah quickly texted James, "Your brother was at your house. Spent 2 hours there. Elizabeth seemed upset when he left." The reply came almost instantly. "Follow him." Sarah started the car and began the pursuit. Michael drove through the center of town and eventually stopped near a high-rise building on Montgomery Street. Sarah knew the place. It was home to the offices of several large law firms. Parking nearby, Sarah pulled out her laptop and began searching for information on the companies located in the building. One firm caught her eye. Goldstein and Associates, family law and probate specialists. Sarah's heart beat faster. The situation was getting more and more confusing. Was Elizabeth really planning a divorce? But that didn't explain her health problems and her emotional connection to Michael. An hour later, Michael emerged from the building with a thick folder of papers. He looked serious and concerned. Sarah took a few more pictures and sent a new message to James. That evening, Sarah met with James in his office to discuss the results of the first few days of surveillance. James looked haggard with dark circles under his eyes. "Mr. Hampton," Sarah began, "I understand that the situation seems troubling, but I'm not sure we're dealing with a romantic relationship between your wife and brother. There are a few facts that don't add up to that picture." James raised an eyebrow. "Go on." Sarah opened her laptop and began showing pictures and playing audio recordings. "First of all, your wife met with the doctor. They discussed some health issues. Dr. Reynolds, who Elizabeth met with, is a renowned oncologist. Second, your brother visited the office of a law firm specializing in family law and probate matters. Third, the emotional connection between them seems supportive rather than romantic." James listened intently, his face growing more tense with each word. "What are you suggesting?" he asked finally. Sarah took a deep breath. "Mr. Hampton, at this stage of the investigation, I can't draw any definitive conclusions. But there are indications that your wife may have a serious health problem. She may have sought legal advice from your brother regarding her condition, but that's just a guess. We need more information." James leaned back in his chair, his face pale. "Oh my God," he whispered. "I've been such an idiot. I don't know what I was thinking." Sarah smiled softly. "Mr. Hampton, in my work, I often encounter situations where people assume the worst, but the reality often turns out to be quite different. Let me investigate further. I suggest the following steps. First, we need to deepen our surveillance of Elizabeth's medical visits. Second, we need more information about the legal advice your brother is receiving. And third, I would like to install hidden cameras and microphones in your home, if you authorize it." James nodded, looking both relieved and worried at the same time. "Do whatever you feel you need to do, Miss Johnson." On June 3rd, after nearly a month of intense surveillance, Sarah Johnson sat in her car parked in front of California Pacific Medical Center. She had just witnessed the scene that had finally put all the pieces of the puzzle together, and was now preparing to make the toughest call of her career. With trembling hands, she dialed James Hampton's number. When he answered, his voice sounded strained and tired. "Mr. Hampton," Sarah began, trying to make her voice sound professional despite the emotions raging inside. "I have the final report on your case. But before I present it, I want you to know, what I've uncovered could be very difficult for you." A heavy pause hung on the other end of the line. Finally, James replied, "I'm ready to hear the truth, Miss Johnson, whatever it may be." Sarah took a deep breath and began. Mr. Hampton, based on all the evidence I have gathered, I have come to the conclusion that your wife, Elizabeth, was recently diagnosed with terminal cancer. She has no more than 6 months to live. She heard James draw in air sharply but continued. Your brother, Michael, does not have a romantic relationship with Elizabeth. He is helping her settle legal and financial matters to protect you from a sudden blow. Oh my God, James whispered. Elizabeth, is she dying? I'm so sorry, Mr. Hampton, Sarah replied softly. But yes, she is. Let me explain how I came to that conclusion. Sarah began to recount the events of the past weeks. She described Elizabeth's numerous visits to oncologists, the chemotherapy she was undergoing in secret, the meetings with lawyers and financial advisors. Today I followed Elizabeth as she came into the hospital for another chemotherapy session, Sarah continued. Your brother was with her. I was able to eavesdrop on their conversation, and that finally cleared things up. She turned on the audio recording. Elizabeth's voice sounded weak and tired. Michael, I don't know how much longer I can keep this hidden. James is starting to suspect something. I can see the way he's looking at me. I know it's hard, Liz, Michael replied softly, but we're almost done with the legal formalities. As soon as everything is ready, you can tell him. And what if I don't live to see that moment? Elizabeth asked, and Sarah heard her sob. Don't say that, Michael said sternly. Dr. Reynolds said you still have time. We're going to fight this together, okay? Now let's see those trust documents. Sarah turned off the tape. Mr. Hampton, I understand how this must sound to you, but I want you to know your wife and brother didn't betray you. They were trying to protect you, to give you time to prepare for the inevitable. There was silence on the other end of the line. Sarah could almost physically feel the shock and pain that James must be feeling right now. Mr. Hampton, she called out softly, are you still here? Yes, he finally answered, his voice sounding hoarse. I don't know what to say. How could I have been so blind? How could I have suspected them of... God, I'm a terrible husband. Don't blame yourself, Sarah said firmly. You acted on the information you had, and that's why Elizabeth and Michael tried so hard to cover it up. They knew you would blame yourself. What am I supposed to do now? James asked, and in his voice Sarah could hear the confusion of a man whose world had just crumbled. I think you need to talk to Elizabeth, Sarah replied softly. She needs your support now more than ever. And Mr. Hampton, don't waste any time. Every moment counts right now. Yes, you're right, James said. Thank you, Miss Johnson, for everything. You're welcome, Mr. Hampton. I hope you and your family find the strength to get through this. Sarah ended the call and leaned back in her seat, feeling emotionally drained. She had investigated hundreds of infidelity cases in her career, but had never before encountered a situation like this one. She watched Elizabeth and Michael walk out of the hospital. Elizabeth looked pale and exhausted, leaning on Michael's arm for support. Sarah knew that tonight would change the lives of this family forever. James Hampton sat in his car parked in front of the mansion he shared with Elizabeth. After his conversation with Sarah Johnson, he couldn't bring himself to enter the house right away. His mind was engulfed in a whirlwind of emotions. Shock, grief, guilt, anger, all mixed into a toxic cocktail that seemed to paralyze him. Finally, taking a deep breath, he got out of the car and slowly made his way to the front door. Each step was difficult, as if an invisible weight was weighing on his shoulders. As he opened the door, he heard soft voices coming from the living room, Elizabeth and Michael. For a moment, James was seized with irrational rage. How could they keep something like this from him? But that flash of anger was quickly replaced by a wave of shame. He remembered how he had suspected them of cheating, how he had hired a detective to follow them. Now, those actions seemed incredibly petty and selfish to him. He entered the living room and the conversation stopped momentarily. Elizabeth and Michael looked at him with expressions of worry and guilt on their faces. James felt a lump come up to his throat. "I know," he said quietly, his voice trembling. "I know everything." Elizabeth turned pale, her eyes filling with tears. "James, we wanted to tell you. I just didn't know how." Michael stood up, ready to defend Elizabeth, but James shook his head. "Don't, Mike. I understand everything. I understand now." He walked over to Elizabeth and knelt down in front of her, taking her hands in his. "Why didn't you tell me sooner? We could have gone through this together." Elizabeth burst into tears, her body shaking with sobs. "I didn't want you to suffer. I thought I could beat this and you wouldn't have to know. And then when it became clear that it was impossible, I didn't know how to tell you I was leaving." James pulled her to him, hugging her tightly. His own tears were now flowing freely down his cheeks. "You're not alone in this, do you hear me? We're going to fight together, until the very end." Michael quietly left the room, giving them time alone. James and Elizabeth sat in each other's arms for a long time, crying and whispering words of love and forgiveness. In the months that Elizabeth hid her diagnosis from James, her emotional state was complex and contradictory. Every day she struggled with a spectrum of feelings that threatened to consume her. Fear was her constant companion, fear of illness, of pain, of the unknown. But most of all, Elizabeth feared for James. She knew how much he loved her, and the thought of having to leave him alone ripped at her heart. Guilt weighed heavily on her shoulders. Guilt for hiding the truth from her husband, for relying on Michael, for involving him in this web of secrets. Sometimes at night, when James slept soundly beside her, she cried, hating herself for lying, but not finding the strength to tell the truth. Anger was also part of her emotional palette. Anger at the unfairness of fate, at the fact that her life would be cut short so early when she and James still had so many plans. She was angry at her body that had betrayed her, at the doctors who couldn't offer a miraculous cure. But more than anything else, Elizabeth felt love, an all-consuming, deep love for James. Every moment with him was precious, every smile, every touch memorized by her like a treasure. She tried to soak up every second of their time together, knowing that their time was limited. There was also a sense of gratitude for the years she'd spent with James, for his love and support, for Michael, who had been her support during these difficult times, for the life she had lived, albeit too short. When the truth was finally revealed, Elizabeth felt strangely relieved. No more pretending, no more carrying this burden alone. Seeing the pain in James's eyes was unbearable, but at the same time his love and support gave her new strength. In the last months of her life, Elizabeth finally allowed herself to be vulnerable. She cried with James, laughed with him, shared her fears and hopes. Every day was filled with a love and closeness they had never experienced before. Elizabeth left life with a sense of peace. She knew she had been loved, that she had left behind something meaningful in the form of their charitable foundation. And although she was sad to leave James, she believed that their love would live on even after her death. 5 years later, on a sunny September day, James Hampton stood in front of the entrance to the new wing of the California Pacific Medical Center. A sign shone on the front of the building, Elizabeth Hampton Cancer Research Center. James took a deep breath, feeling a lump come up to his throat. The opening ceremony was scheduled to begin in an hour. It was the culmination of 5 years of hard work, sleepless nights, and tireless effort. After Elizabeth's death, James had devoted himself entirely to the development of the charitable foundation they had founded together. He had invested not only a significant portion of his fortune, but his entire soul into it. "You'd be proud of that, Liz," he whispered, looking up at the building. At that moment, he felt a hand on his shoulder. "She would be proud, James. I'm sure she is," Michael said as he stood next to his brother. Over the years, their relationship had grown stronger than ever. The tragedy they had experienced had brought them closer together, turning them from just brothers to best friends and associates. Michael left his former job and fully devoted himself to legal support of the Elizabeth Foundation. Together, they created an organization that not only funded cutting-edge cancer research, but also supported families facing this terrible disease. "Come on, we need to get ready for the ceremony," Michael said, and the brothers headed inside the building. They were met in the lobby by Sarah Johnson. She had kept in touch with James after the investigation was completed, and over time had become an important part of the foundation team in charge of public relations. "All set, James," she said with a smile. "The press is already gathering, and Dr. Reynolds wants to discuss a few things with you before the presentation." James nodded and followed Sarah. As he walked through the corridors of the new center, he couldn't help but admire how far they had come. The laboratories here were state-of-the-art, equipped with the latest technology. A team of leading oncologists from all over the world were working on new methods of cancer treatment and early diagnosis. But most important to James was the support department for patients and their families. This was where psychologists, social workers, and support groups worked. James knew from his own experience how important this help was. The opening ceremony was perfect. James gave a moving speech, telling Elizabeth's story and how her struggle inspired the creation of this center. He spoke about hope, the power of love, and the importance of every moment of life. After the formal portion, as the crowd began to disperse, James was approached by a young woman with a little girl. "Mr. Hampton," she said timidly, "I just wanted to thank you. Your foundation paid for my daughter's treatment when we had no hope anymore. She is healthy today, and it is thanks to you and your wife's memory." James knelt down to be level with the girl. "What's your name, Sunshine?" he asked with a smile. "Elizabeth," the girl replied shyly. "Mommy said I was named after your wife." James felt tears come to his eyes. He gently stroked the girl's head. "It's a beautiful name, and I'm sure you'll grow up to be as brave and strong as she is." In the evening, after all the guests had dispersed, James went up to the roof of the building. From here he had a beautiful view of San Francisco, flooded with the golden light of the setting sun. He pulled a picture of Elizabeth out of his pocket, the same one from their wedding that had once stood on his desk at work. "We did it, my love," he whispered, looking at the photo. "I hope you're proud of us." A light breeze touched his face, and for a moment James thought he felt Elizabeth's presence close by. He smiled, knowing that, although she was no longer around physically, her love and legacy continued to live on and help others. Over the years, James had learned to live without Elizabeth, but he had never stopped loving her. He dedicated his life to helping others and in the process found new meaning and purpose. The Elizabeth Hampton Foundation has become one of the largest charitable organizations in the country funding cancer research. Their work had helped thousands of people, and James knew this was just the beginning. He often thought back to those last months with Elizabeth, filled with pain but also incredible love. Those memories no longer caused acute pain, but filled him with gratitude for their time together. James realized that the tragedy that nearly ruined his life had ultimately made him stronger and wiser. He learned to appreciate every moment, every smile, every act of kindness. Standing on the roof of the center that bore his wife's name, James felt peaceful. He knew there was more work to be done, many lives to be helped. But he also knew that the memory of Elizabeth and the love they shared would always guide him. With one last look at the city, James turned and headed for the exit. Tomorrow was a new day, a new opportunity to make a difference in someone's life, and he was ready to face it with an open heart and hope in his soul. Life went on, and although Elizabeth was no longer physically around, her love and legacy continued to live on through James and the thousands of lives their foundation had touched. And in that was the true victory over death, in the continuation of love and care, in the legacy of kindness and compassion.